This is a message to all my supporters of this podcast. I'm introducing a new supporters program. You can contribute a small amount as a one-off payment to show your love for this podcast. Thank you in advance for all your contributions.
This is the Absolute Business Mindset podcast, created and hosted by Mark Hayward. I'm a corporate employee with an entrepreneurial mindset. This podcast will help and support you with new ideas about business. These are my thoughts, ideas, and comments. Today, I'm going to speak to Suzanne Doyle Morris, who has had a career in lots of different areas with women's studies and engagement with women in business. So hopefully you'll enjoy our conversation. Hi, Suzanne. Nice to speak to you. We're gonna delve back to your origin story. So you did a BA in psychology and women's studies and a PhD in educational research. What brought that to making those decisions?
So essentially, I did my first degree, that was the psychology and women's studies, back in the States where I'm from. So despite how I sound, and I've lived in the UK over 20 years, very happily. I'm originally from Washington, D.C., and I did that degree because I was fascinated by both the experiences of women historically, but also the psychology of what that means for individual women. So fast forward, what that meant was I ended up jumping across the pond, shall we say, and doing work for Trinity College Dublin for about 6 months before taking a few years to work in London. Right. And at the time, I met a guy we started dating, and I said, well, I've got to go back and do my graduate work at some point. And he said, well, why don't you just stay here and do it? And the funny thing is, I said, you know what? I'm going to be back in the States for the rest of my life. So says all of us who think we've got a plan, don't we? Yeah. And I said, I'll be back in the States. And I said, the difficulty is while the UK has got amazing universities throughout it, there's really only 2 that Americans have heard of. And so I told him, I said, but the problem is I would never get into either of those. And he says, well, why don't you just try? And long story short, I tried, and I did. I got into Cambridge. So I was really lucky. And the reason I did educational research is what I decided to focus on was looking at the experiences of women who work in very male-dominated fields. Yeah. But it became education because I ended up working with engineering students. Because at the time, and I'm sad to say it's still the same, less than 14% of engineering graduates in the UK are women. Yep. So I really wanted to understand what was going on for them, why they entered it at all, why more people didn't enter it. And that's how I ended up doing that particular PhD. And, that was the beginning of the rest of my career, because after that I started consulting and coaching. Coaching got me back to my psychology background, but realistically, I really wanted to focus on understanding, women who work in fields where there's just very few of them, so that we can get more into fields where they could benefit, and those sectors could, essentially get a diversity of thought in the work that they're doing. And that's been, the last 20 years.
Yeah. So why do you think traditional sectors like engineering and science have always struggled to attract women?
So here's the funny thing. They haven't always struggled to attract. So most people are really surprised to know that when you look at, say, computer science, in the 50s, the 40s, early on, there were actually more women in those sectors than men. And if you even go back to, when we talk about there's a bug in the system and there's, that technology, what they're referring to is that goes back decades. And at the time, women were behind computers removing moths and other bugs from the backs of computers. And they were ideal, supposedly, because they had small hands. So it really was a move from computing, for example, as being an administrative task to something in the late 70s and 80s certainly got taken over as something people started to say, whoa, this could pay pretty well. We need some more men in this. And so that is a really pen picture of the fact that actually even the sectors we think are just have always been that way. They're not. So the more recent reason, though, is because for some of those other sectors is because they're so dependent on students at A level and before doing maths and science subjects, and not doing them, which a lot of women don't elect to do them. You can't get in later. So you can't go from, say, being an art student very easily to deciding in your third year that actually, you know what, I want to do physics. It's almost like the ship has sailed. So, which is too bad, realistically. And boys are more likely to go into the physical sciences.
So why did you get a passion for women in the workplace? Was it an inequality thing? Was it the sectors that interested you? What was your drive and your passion behind it?
I think it was an inequality thing. I've got to be honest. I think part of what I was driven by initially when I first came over to the UK is I fundamentally believe you can't do a women's studies degree like I was, fortunate enough to do without coming out really grateful for the amount of opportunities that I now had that my mother didn't have, and certainly my grandmother never had. So I really wanted to come over and have a, here we go, year or two in the UK. And going back to best laid plans, which I'm sure, Mark, you and many of your listeners will know that. I thought I'd be here a year or two, have my adventure before a husband and children and a big corporate job. But what I realistically, I loved it. I loved Britain, and I ended up staying so long that now I'm, legally I have, I'm as British as you are. I've got all citizenship. And the crazy thing is, at first when I came over would have been considered an unskilled immigrant,
really?
according to the new standards that are coming in. You need 70 points. And when I looked at those, what qualifies you with those 70 points, I wouldn't have had them. Wow. But now I'm an employer. I do a lot of work with big corporates, but I certainly wouldn't have been, one of your highly skilled migrants, not at that time. I certainly didn't have the PhD or anything of that nature. So for me, it wasn't about equality, but it was also about understanding what makes those women tick. Because it really does take, the courage of your convictions to go into a room day after day. And that may be a lab, that may be a business room, that may be, a meetings room, a lecture theater, where you are one of 10 or one of 30. And I just thought, gosh, that is a real sense of confidence, but one we don't really talk about, because to be that minority person is, I just knew that there must be something psychologically really interesting going on for those women. And that really, it interested me hugely.
And what is actually is there a contrast between the UK and the US when it comes to women's inequality?
So there's differences. And so some of the differences revolve around parenting leave. So the UK, and certainly Europe, much more so even than the UK, have got better coverage for maternity leave, and now paternity leave, as we're seeing. So there's differences there, but really there's far more. They have far more in common than there is, than there are differences. And the irony is that I've not ever really worked with that many American companies. My career has been primarily in the UK and Europe, and even some in the Middle East, because where there are differences, there's just far more similarities.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Hi, I'm Alex, the host of X Health Show, Meet the Future of Healthcare. Think X-Men, that's X Health. Actual superheroes behind programming living cells to cure cancer once and for all. Tech that detects preterm delivery in seconds, brain-computer interface, or apps that employ AI to match you, your disease, with the best treatment. X Health Show brings to you visionaries who push the boundaries of healthcare from Switzerland, the heart of Europe and the most innovative country in the world. Let me introduce you to their startups. Head to X Health Show, Meet the Future of Healthcare. Happy to greet you there.
And so you said you've been working in this area for 20 plus years?
Yeah. My first degree, women's studies and psychology, and the maths is such that it has definitely been more than 25 years.
And so what do you feel there's been progress that's happened when it comes to gender inequality?
Well, I think that some of the things, so I'll give you an example. When I first started consulting, so it was about maybe 15, 16 years ago, people really criticized or joked about my niche, my specialism. I was going to work with women in male-dominated fields, and the response was always, often from men, I would say, oh, but there's hardly any women in those fields. You won't have any clients. But as anyone who niches, who specializes in a sector knows, you don't need to be perfect for everybody, but you need to be perfect for a group so that they know that you get them. Yeah. So in terms of, in terms of the differences, I think what we found was that they just felt that they, were better understood. And that led me to my first book, which was called Beyond the Boys Club, which was about what does it take, not just to survive, but to thrive in a field that is dominated by men.
And so I've been involved in the finance industry for about 13 years now. And
wow.
So I've worked for a Big Four accountancy firm, and I would say over those 13 years, females have definitely increased in numbers, which is great, which is fantastic. Equally, a lot of the people that move from a Big Four accountancy firm into a bank are increasingly women again. Do you think that the finance industry has turned a corner when it comes to gender inequality?
For my most recent book, I did interview quite a few bankers. And what's interesting to me is that turning a corner, I'm a big data person. Sorry, I'm a bit of a nerd. And so I really want to see the data before I would say they turn the corner. What I would say is that they are paying much more attention to it because it gets headlines. In a way that it never did before. So going back to when I started, people made fun of my niche. They'd say, oh, there's hardly any women in those areas. But now you often see women featured in the press, and the fight for equality is much more front and center stage. And a lot of that is not necessarily about what's going on in the workplace, though it does affect it. It's everything from Me Too on to, everyday sexism. Those types of campaigns have been huge. And while they're not technically about the workplace, they filter into everything about work. So there's just been a lot more, so while I would say in terms of turning the corner, there's a lot more attention on it. What I wouldn't say is that we've seen a huge change in the types of leaders who are still at the top of those organizations, certainly not in finance.
And do you think the quality? Well, I don't know for a fact, but I would imagine pay is a massive issue, and one of the issues which probably still happens relatively regularly. I don't know for myself, but the difference in pay between a male and a female probably still has a difference.
Yes, so there is a pay discrepancy, but what's really interesting about the gender pay gap is the fact that where it happens, it's often, I'll give you a funny example. I had a coaching client recently who, well, not recently, in the last year when it became really big deal, and she worked in a big bank, and she got a very nice promotion, which included a significant pay increase. And she was surprised because she hadn't asked for that much money, but they said, oh, you know what, we need to do this just to bring you up to where the guys, and her mentor told her, the middling guys are in your in this team, and you are stellar, but we need to not, to put you up so much just to be to where some of our historic average performers are. So that was dismaying to her, but she took the money and ran it, as I would encourage any woman to do in that situation, not to question what the motivation is, but just to say, you know what, I'm not going to feel like I need to work harder, because what they're doing is finally recognizing that I am, and treating me as they've treated the men historically, which is just assuming good things about me.
Yes. Do you think that's a difference of the psychology of men and women, where men are more traditionally, as you say, would just accept it and they would take it as a recognition of their own worth, where I'm looking for guidance here, but females slightly don't always recognize themselves?
I think that you have called out something that was really relevant to why I wrote my third book, The Con Job.
Yeah.
So The Con Job is very much about how we love to say that women don't have any confidence, but men have loads. But I think a lot of that difference that we see when we see it is largely because when women take on any kind of, when they show the same types of behaviors that we praise guys for. So we'll say a guy is driven, he takes no prisoners, he's really forward thinking. When a woman shows those exact same behaviors, we think of her as stroppy and bitchy and really difficult or aggressive. So even when people show confidence, and you are right, men do tend to show confidence more in a way that we associate with leaders. But part of the reason we associate with leaders is because most leaders have historically been men. So they have modeled what leadership behavior looks like, where we're not used to seeing those behaviors in women. And so we penalize them. I mean, I'll give you an example. One of my favorite words, and when I say favorite, I actually kind of mean least favorite, is feisty. So feisty is really a phrase that people use to describe women, but actually it makes me laugh because it's a word for, small animals with no real power. I have yet to hear a white man of, 56 years old being described as feisty. Oh, he is so feisty.
Yeah. So I'm interested in this because I've got two young girls, and me and my wife are trying to bring up them as strong, independent, but you obviously you need support and need help from friends or family or whatever.
We all do, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. How would you, I don't know if you have kids, but how do you approach when you're trying to think about children opposed to sort of adults that are in their career? What's the sort of key takeaways that we can build female children's, girls' mindset to get in the right frame of mind when they go to work?
So I think we have to think about the way we chastise children generally. So, for example, girls when they're young are more likely, and we continue to see this in the workplace, they're much more likely if there's an opinionated girl, let's say a 9-year-old, and she tells people what she thinks, and she's trying to drive the action between her and her friends, she'll say something that she might get chastised for being bossy. But realistically, you say, well, that's good leadership behavior, but maybe you want to listen more.
Yeah.
So we rarely describe boys as being, children as being bossy compared to, and you see that continually. So, when I've written this third book, I interviewed nearly 40 leaders from around the world to look at how do we define confidence? Is that working for us as a whole? With our expectations around what confidence looks like, because my concern is that confidence also often looks like a show. It's a very showy, almost theatrical, the person who talks the most in meetings, the person who bangs their fist on the table, the person who puts themselves forward. But actually, those behaviors, they don't work for a wide range of people who are not just women, but maybe you've been raised in a more collectivist or less individualistic culture, like people from parts of Asia. Or maybe you are just more of an introvert and you're not the kind who's gonna be the first to talk and the first to give presentations and do killer sales presentations. That's not your bag. And we ascribe those behaviors as being confident. But even if people who are not status quo, as I call them, status quo being kind of closer to what you expect from leadership, so kind of the older male, white, heterosexual, able-bodied, English-speaking, all of those things who tend to make up more of the leaders that we have in society, when those behaviors that I just described are shown by people who are not that status quo, we penalize them for it. So, for example, I'm sure you're not surprised to know that President Obama was routinely kept his cool on most things, but even when he showed any annoyance with some of the things said about him, people loved to describe him as angry. He's an angry black man. And that really puts people behind you. Whereas for a lot of people, they would say, for status quo, people would say, oh, he's just standing up for himself.
Yeah, assertive or something. Yeah.
He's not taking any BS, but really people referred back to, in the US where I'm from, if a Latino person is, it shows confidence, sometimes they are described as being fiery. But what this went even further than those categories that I just talked about. It also looked at socioeconomic class, because that came out a lot in the book as well. So when people who are from more working class traditional backgrounds show confidence, I got to be honest, Mark, Britain, and I've been here a long time, but it was the first place I ever learned the phrase being above your station.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And does that make sense?
It does. It's based on the class system that we used to have in the UK.
Yes. So there's that whole sense of, he's getting a bit too big for his boots.
Yeah.
And that, so we have a class system around that too. So realistically, the words we use to describe people really are affected by who the person is, rather than solely the behavior they're displaying. Because if we show that behavior, that kind of forward-thinking drive in a status quo man, a guy who's passionate, who speaks with conviction, will describe a woman who does that as being brazen or pushy, and a person from a working class background as needing to know their place.
So I find that really interesting. So I know you've had a fascination with gender inequality, and I totally understand that. But how does gender inequality, I think we've touched on it there, but things like race, sexual orientation, class, how does is there similarities across all of them, or are they distinctly like female inequality is a separate thing to other discriminations in the workplace?
It is, in terms of the fact that women are just over half the population, and we rarely take kindly to a woman who is demonstrating, conviction and what I would say is confidence. But what surprised me about this research that I've done is that it really spilled into other types of groups as well. So another way another way I look at being status quo is also about, it seems really simple, but being a native English speaker, if you work for a company that is headquartered in the English speaking world, well, that really helps you. Because I interviewed people who said, I don't come across, I used to think of my British or American colleagues as being so smart and so confident because they always got right in there on those, conference calls. But realistically, what I'm trying to do, or people like me, and this was a woman who was Flemish, she said, I am trying to translate what's going on in the meeting into my third language before I can even begin to contribute.
Yeah.
And that hesitation in that meeting, that will read as a lack of confidence. And what worries me about that, Mark, is that what's really interesting is that if you and I agree, okay, so that people who speak English and who don't speak English probably have roughly the same number of good ideas, then I worry about what we're missing when we don't hear those voices. And in a global world, we need more of those voices, and organizations do as well, because they are, they're recruiting from all over the world.
I totally agree. So we've had in my workplace, I've worked in a couple of the big four accountancy firms. There's been sometimes they're rotated, sometimes they're permanent, sometimes they're localized, of people from Europe, from Asia, from the US, Australia, coming to the UK to work there. Now let's just distinguish the English speaking versus the non-English speaking. I think there is a real there's a cultural difference. There's as you say, trying to translate something from their native language into English, but I think it is getting better. I think with the globalized world, I think people are a lot more sensitive to cultural, to sexual orientation, to women inequality. I think there is progress that is being made. I suppose you might say, is it fast enough?
Yeah, so I would. That's my thing is I need to see data to show that and unfortunately, the data shows it's not moving fast enough.
Okay.
So we have seen, Lean In organization last year did some research. They've been doing the same research for 5 years, and they found the only place, and this was Lean In, so it's women, but the only place where there's real change, and when we say change, it's still pretty glacial at the pace it's happening, has been with the number of women at board level. But not women in any other management level. So those numbers are more stagnant than we would like to believe they are. So that's a gender-based piece of research. And you've said something slightly different, but I don't know some of the other research that you're talking about, though I would say, yes, I would like to see that there's progress, because frankly, modern businesses have to get with the program, for want of a better phrase, if they want to succeed, because they're trying to sell into so many more different markets, and they're trying to collect, they're trying to hire talent from around the world. So if you have a really very monotheistic way that you praise confidence, you're not going to get ahead. And just going back to that point about the boards, the only reason companies have made any progress with boards is because we've had legislation throughout Europe and increased focus on that in the last few years. So it's a very visual thing that is public. And you can be called out on the fact that you're not making progress on it. So that's interesting to me, because that's where the change has happened, but it hasn't happened as much as we'd like to tell ourselves it has. It hasn't happened for women further down the line, which, let's be honest, if you're at board level, everybody else is further down the line.
Yes. So tell me about your new book, The Con Job.
Yeah. So essentially it's essentially about getting known for your competence in a world that I think is obsessed with confidence. So, I came to it because most of my clients and a lot of people, you'll know as well, we say that people that say, I said, what do you want to get out of these sessions? And they say, I want to get more confidence. But what they often mean is, I want to be heard more in meetings. I want recognition for my ideas and the work that I do, and I want more opportunities. To them, like, confidence seems like a panacea of, if I have more confidence, it will just fix everything. But actually, it isn't. And what really worries me is that it's actually conversely related to competence. So what that means is that the more confident you become, research shows, the less you worry about your competence. That is how good you are at your darn job. And that's really worrying for businesses, or it should be really worrying for businesses.
And so what do you think, What do you want people to take away from this book? Do you want people to understand that they are competent, and confidence can come in various degrees? Like males can be introverted and extroverted, females can be introverted or extroverted, but it's more down to your competence, right? And if you are competent, then confidence will flow from there.
Yes. So for me, it is, you've hit the nail on the head. So you focus on your competence first, because if you can remember things that you've done in the past that you really probably thought were beyond you, that itself will help you own confidence. But really focus on your competence, because actually everything else will feel like, if you just go in saying, oh, I need confidence, and you focus on like faking it till you make it, well, you'll only ever still feel like an imposter, like you're about to be found out. And more worryingly for your employer, as well as your own sense of self, you will focus, if you become really confident, you'll worry less about maintaining the credibility you have through your competence. So that's the person in the office who, you can say, who could do this? And they're like, oh, I've got it. When their confidence is great, but actually, that they're not going to put the amount of work into it and make a really stellar product. They'll just get by. But I mean, the phrases that I learned in the UK, and, all these years, like blagging it, and just, that kind of talk is really, it denotes how commonplace this is. And yet we are rewarding the wrong things. So what I want people to do is, I want us as leaders, but also as people who hire colleagues and all of that, I want us to focus on our competence and reward that. Don't go for just the loudest duck to promote simply because they talk about how great they are. So reward your competence. I'd like people to redefine what we think of as confidence. And for me, that's about the courage of your convictions. That's also about going against the grain. And it's also about having good self-awareness and a humility in that, because it does take confidence. I'll give you a very short story. One of the women I interviewed was a VP for Procter & Gamble, and she's Indian, but she was working in Singapore. And she said she had this boss who would, in the first few months of her working in this role, he'd walk the floor and he would shout out questions. And he'd stop and he'd ask you, and if you didn't have an immediate answer to a pretty technical question, he would shout you down. So he sounds like a real fun guy, right, Mark? Yeah. Anyway, one day, so she's a few months into her job, and the boss, I guess he's like trying to pep talk her or something. He asked her in the office, and he says, so how are you finding this? And she burst out. She doesn't cry. She said, you're the reason I hate coming into work every day.
Wow. Wow.
So he looks at her. She looks as shocked as he does, because she can't believe it actually came out of her mouth. But the good thing is, he said, how so? Can you tell me more? And he asked for examples of things that he had done, not just to her, but to other people. And he said, you know what? Okay, I didn't know that I had this impact on people, because it was around the whole office. And she said, okay, he said, you know what, give me a couple months, and then I'm going to ask you back to give me some more feedback. And she said 3 months later, she said he wasn't a completely new person, but he had made significant inroads.
Wow.
And so I highlight that story because he was really focused on self-awareness and having a humility in that. And while that story sounds like it's about her confidence in telling him what a terrible boss he was, I actually think it's also about his confidence in listening.
Yes.
Seeking the feedback, listening, and then making change. He didn't just say, well, she's getting fired, because actually, if you take that approach, you're saying, oh, I can never be challenged. I could never grow. I can't be better than I am now.
So sorry, go on.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, it's so much. I've talked quite a bit about leadership, and actually, the further you go up as a leader, you should be listening just as much as you're talking.
Definitely. I would say even more. I mean, yeah. And she really, so what I like about that example is because they both had to show confidence in that moment. But let's be very clear, the way she did it and the way he did it are not what we think of when we think what confidence is and what it looks like. So I think we really need to redefine it so that it works for a wider range of people. Because there are people who are very self-aware, but they don't get told that they're confident and they make changes. But it does take, a sense of humility and listening to make changes. And, and I got to be honest, I've had feedback in the past that have been painful, but if I can make the changes, and I have, then I come out better. Yes. I'm more competent. I'm, more compelling, convincing, whatever you want to be. But all of that helps grow my confidence. But that's like almost like a side effect benefit. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. So you set up the Inclusic Institute. Tell me about that.
Well, so that's my business now. We've got about 5 people who are working with us, and really, for me, it's about making sure that the right people are getting ahead. And I don't only mean men. I don't mean just women either. I mean a mix. But what I want to see getting ahead, and the people that I work with, are those who are a bit more forward thinking, who kind of understand that this is the future. I have a client now, actually, who I historically work primarily with their women, and I'm really delighted that within like 3 or 4 months of working with them, 3 of the women had got promotions. So that was awesome. However, this client was really forward thinking, and they started giving me a few guys to work with. However, the types of guys they gave me were unique. So what they gave me were some of their men that they had identified were a bit more progressive in their views and really, really represented what they think, 21st century leadership is going to be about. Yep. Not the listen to me, I'm going to bang my table and shout the loudest, but the people who can actually listen, learn, and get on with, a wider range of people. So I was really impressed by that, because normally, with coaching, people give you people who they want to take to the next level. But and that's a great place to start. But what I liked about this was that they were picking the guys that they think are going to help them lead, this new workforce. And this, that client is a male dominated field too. It's in aviation. But they kind of realize that if you're not part of this going forward, you're going to be left behind, and nobody wants to be left behind. And actually it's a far better place, because here's my secret, is that this redefinition of confidence, it doesn't just benefit women, it benefits men as well. Yep. And you might say, how's that possible? But but actually pretending to be confident, we assume women don't have any confidence, but we assume men have loads, which means men don't talk about the issues that they've got. And we've got a huge mental health crisis with men. I mean, You may be aware, I'm sure you are, that suicide is the number 1 killer of men under 45.
45. Yep. I'm well aware of that. And I think there's a huge focus on, or I hope it's increasing anyway, but about men in society and how men in the workplace and society are actually paving their way as well. I totally appreciate that there still are things that can work with to increase women's equality, but I think there's a slight, the whole idea that men don't share their problems or their issues, they have to be the strong silent type. I think it's a real thing that's impacting definitely the UK, but probably the world.
It is. I mean, these are global statistics. What's even sad, more sad, the WHO, World Health Organization, identifies that for every successful suicide attempt, there's about 20 other attempts.
Wow.
So, it's really sad. It's such a waste for those men who leave us simply because they felt that they had to put up a confident front. Because when you talk to the families of many of these men, they often are really surprised. They're like, oh, he was the life of the party. He seemed to, he always was making people laugh, blah, blah, blah. And he, essentially he's showing a confident front and not asking for help. And it's a waste for those men. It's also a waste for the families they leave behind and the employers who could benefit from them.
Absolutely. What do you think What do you think has the greatest impact? Your books, your speaking, your coaching, your institute? You've had many different streams of impacting people. What do you think has the biggest impact?
I don't know. Actually, I guess you'd have to ask the people who I've interacted with. So on a brass tacks basis, I think for promotions, probably the women that I've worked with individually. It's only recently that I've started working with individual coaching individual men. But that is a big tick box for impact. If you're looking for what is the biggest impact, getting a promotion is a big impact. That we can tick that box. I've had people come up to me years later after they've read books of mine and said how much it helped them. But the speaking is great too, because I go and I'll speak in front of hundreds of people. And people, come up to me right after and they say, wow, I've never thought about this in that way, whatever this is. And so that's, even all I'm trying to do is, frankly, Mark, just what you're trying to do, which is get people to think differently. So if I can do that, then, that's the impact I want to have.
Excellent. So as you said, you've spoken abroad. You've spoken in a number of countries. So we sort of covered this at the start, but I just want to delve back into it. What do you think the country dynamics are about gender equality?
Well, what do you?
Let's just say in regions, for example. So we talked a little bit earlier on about the US and the UK, but is Asia and Australia facing similar problems, similar issues?
So the world
Africa, Middle East.
It's everywhere. These issues are everywhere, but they show up differently depending on the country you're in. So it's kind of hard to say, oh, it's all this, it's all this way in Asia or it's all this way in Africa, because they're all such different places.
Yes,
that it's
absolutely.
Hard to say. So I'll give you an example. So for example, in the UK, we like to talk about how sad it is that too few women go and study STEM. And that is truth. We have too few women who study STEM. However, that is not an issue in lots of parts of Asia.
Right.
In fact, if you want to know who's studying in the UK, who the women are on those courses, they are often Asian women. So when I did my PhD, I was looking at universities across the UK, and if I met women who were studying engineering, 9 times out of 10, they were an Asian woman who was studying abroad here in the UK. So that's an issue that we like to think, the lack of women in STEM. We like to think that that's a global problem, but it's not actually. It's, going back to my point, it's by country, there are different issues. However, there is no matriarchal country. We don't have any of those yet. And I don't think we ever will. And frankly, women aren't looking for, we're not looking, to take over. We just want equality. To know that we're earning the same as the guy next to us. To know that we have just as much chance of getting that senior job as the guy next to us. And unfortunately, those things are not currently equal. And that is still that goes on around the world, and for wide variety of reasons. But those reasons will be different depending what country you're talking about. Yeah.
And so coaching women. So it sounds like you've impacted a number of women in business. How not as in how do you coach women? How do you approach your coaching? Do you have a particular strategy, a particular model that you would approach consulting, coaching someone?
So I was trained and I'm ICF accredited. So I was trained around coactive coaching, which is essentially just the client knows best, know what they need and what they want. So for me, I'm never giving advice, which is always it's funny because people think with the number of books, well, I've written 3 books. And what's really funny is people think I'm going to give them a lot of advice, but actually I don't give them advice. I just listen. And I help them find and then take their own advice. And a lot of coaching is around accountability. So what that means is just knowing that they're going to see me in a month's time is often the thing that gets them doing the homework that, things that they set themselves. So we say, so the approach is, always very simple. What do you want to get out of this session?
Yeah.
And at the beginning, we get, what do they want to get from all of the sessions? And we always drive it back to, okay, how is that particular session going to feed that initial first goal you had, whether it is more confidence or a specific promotion or whatever it is. So I don't have a specific strategy other than listening and then rephrasing what I think I'm hearing. And then they agree or they don't. But just getting them to take their own advice.
That's very, very interesting. Okay, so we're going to come to a close. As I ask every person that comes on my podcast, I've got 5 questions for you. So these are quick fire questions, but they don't need a quick fire answer, depending on what how you want to respond. So, what's the best decision that you've made in your career?
Okay, probably at 22, deciding to get on a plane at 2 weeks after I graduated to come and try to live in Ireland first and have a little European adventure for a year or two. That probably was the best because it's just led me to, a fantastic nation that I'm really honored to be a citizen of.
That's amazing. Yeah, I'm very proud of where I'm from as well. So, second question, what's the best advice you've been given?
So I am going to have to take a leaf out of your own book, Mark. And when I listen to yours, I think do what you say you're going to do is really important. I think that, you mentioned that in your own podcast when you're answering your questions.
Yeah.
But I gotta be honest, we talk about confidence as being really sexy and compelling, but actually just showing up on time, reliability, those are really what counts. Like just be consistent and show up every day. It's that 90% of success is just doing what you say you're going to do, showing up every day.
100%. Who's helped you most in your career?
So I think I'm like a lot of your listeners in that I've had different mentors or people have helped me throughout my career. And I think one thing is people assume that there's going to be one person, but realistically there's one person at a time potentially, or several. But then, as you progress your career, that may change over time. It's, you want to stay in touch with those original people, but you can move on to the people who are going to teach you new things. And I think that's a key. So for me, where I am now, I would say Lynn Cadenhead, who is the chair of Women's Enterprise Scotland. There is not a person alive who knows more about women's entrepreneurship. She's run many businesses herself. She's a chair on many boards. But what I love about her in particular for me is that, like many self-employed people, many people who run their own businesses, you have some down days, just like regular employees do too. Yep. And she always reminds me, Suzanne, this is your calling. This is what you are great at. So on those down days, she is absolutely fantastic. And then I think the second person I would say is another woman who also is here in Scotland, a woman named Kirsten Lord. And she runs a company called Physiomedics. And what I love about Kirsten is she used to be a physiotherapist, but now she runs a tech company because she saw that there was a link between the types of symptoms people were having for back pain, which is the number one reason people take off sick days, and what she was noticing in her clients. And she is developing an app around that's going to be used by the NHS and around the world to help people diagnose accurately their back issues and other types of issues. But what I love about Kirsten, what she's told me was when I had a down period a few years ago, and she said, go back to all the clients who said no to you and ask them why. And that was so instrumental. Essentially, I needed to understand why they hadn't bought, and everybody was so friendly. They said, "We love what you do, Suzanne, but this particular project you're working on, it's not resonating for us as much." And it was really just, it was what I like to call my summer of humility, to make those 50 calls. I'd be like, "Okay, why didn't you buy?" Oh, that was a hard summer, but it really moved me on. And she was the person who told me to do that.
That's awesome. Do you have any regrets?
So leading to that summer of humility, I got involved in developing video games around unconscious bias in the workplace. And what was so interesting is that people liked the games, but they often found them to be a bit gimmicky, and people would often eventually tell me, the only reason we are buying these games is because you come and you talk about them and you present.
Right.
And I felt like, okay, so what they're telling me is I probably need to go back to my core competency of being live with individuals rather than trying to take this into a tech area. And that was a lot of humility too, because I was overconfident at that moment. I thought I could do that topic. And while I wrote all the games and hired technical people to develop the games, it didn't go as well as I would have liked. So for me, that was a regret, because it was a very costly regret, a very six-figure kind of regret.
Right.
But even when I say that, I still get people who say, "Oh, you're that woman who, did the games. Oh, I heard you." And they say, "I heard you at an event and you're really funny." So I like, so I still get remembered for it. So it's a regret because it bloody cost me, but it still has some, there is a very small silver lining to it.
Absolutely. It was very interesting that you because gamification for interviews, for leading meetings and things like that is something that's very much in vogue at the moment. I'm interested. I was interested that you tried that. Well, is it, as you say, they bought into you. They might not have actually bought into the concept. So you might have had trickle down sort of work from that regret. So it's probably not, although it was a costly one, it probably led you in different directions.
Definitely. I think that's, the key is, what did I learn from that? And then move on. But it probably is my biggest regret, considering that's one of your one of your 5 questions.
Yeah. No, that's a really good answer. A lot of people go over that question quite quickly and don't think about it. So thank you very much for being so honest.
Well, you know what? Honesty, humility is the only thing that's going to get us forward, because, I'm just like everybody else who's listening. I'm trying to figure this out as I go.
Yeah.
And I've been successful, but realistically, as I said, we all have down days. This was a down couple of years, but yes, we've all been there.
Thank you very much. And the last question is, what are you most proud of?
So 2 things I would say. One is my books. All of them have done well in the corporate sector, which is, I'm really honored by that. So those I'm really proud of, because they'll be around forever. Even if nobody's reading them, they'll still be around, and I will remember them when I'm, in my dotage, shall we say. But the other thing I'm really proud of is actually more personal, which is that I have a stepdaughter who I helped raise from the time she was 9, and she went through a really tough teenage years. She and I were really close when she was little, and then when she was a teenager, she got involved with things she shouldn't have. Our relationship, was difficult. But actually, now that she's in her 20s, she's turning things around, and our relationship again is great. And so I'm really glad that I could help. I could be part of turning around that for her. And she was definitely someone who thought, just show the word a confident self, and that's enough. But realistically, I was always like, but you got to do your homework. You got to show up on time places. Yeah. You've got to do what you say you're going to do for people. So being a big personality is not enough. And we didn't agree on that for many years. But what's great is she's kind of now seeing that in her career, that actually, the hard work it kind of pays off.
It needs to be done with everything else. You still need to work really hard and be diligent. And as you say, show up every day.
It's
so
not
important.
sexy. It's not, it's not glamorous, but it's what gets the job done. So turning that relationship around and her career prospects, around in particular, I'm really proud that we've got to that place. And she's nearly 30. So I've been with her a long time, but it was not always, an easy relationship. But I'm very proud of what we have now.
Right. Thank you, Suzanne. That's been very, really interesting. Where can people find you?
So people can find me on Inclusic.com. So that's kind of that's certainly the website, but I also am on LinkedIn. So I'm Suzanne Doyle Morris. I'm one of those hyphenated ladies. And essentially you're also going to find me on Twitter at Inclusic, which is INCLUSIQ.com. And that will allow people to just, find out anything about that, my speaking, but also the books that I've historically done. And if you go to the site now, Inclusic.com, you can sign up and get a free first chapter of the book, which is going to be out really soon. So I'm very excited about that. But just,
when is the book,
sign up
when
and
is
get
the
a
book
free
out?
April 23rd. So
Right.
very excited.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Suzanne. I really appreciate your time. It's been a fascinating delve into inequality, whether it's women inequality or other types of inequality. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll speak again soon.
All right. Take care, Mark. Thanks a lot for having me.
Cheers.